Alright guys, we are up to topic 8.4 of the APUSH curriculum titled Economy After 1945, and this is a really important topic because one of the big things we know about American history after World War II was this unprecedented period of economic growth. And we're going to talk about why that growth happened and what effects that growth had on America and how it's connected back to World War II. So let's talk about this economic boom in America. So from 1950 to 1970, the American economy grew, and didn't just grow a little bit, but grew rapidly. And it really, again, was something basically unprecedented in American history and really modern world history as well. Things just were getting better. Now, that's not to say everyone in America was wealthy and that poverty disappeared, far from it, but in general, Americans really did have it better in those years after World War II. You can just see real economic growth. Okay, you can see how it's growing by a third, by almost 40, actually over 40% in the 50s and 60s. That is tremendous economic growth. So, what social class is going to expand the greatest during this time? That's, of course, the middle class. And the middle class is something we've been looking at now really since about the Gilded Age, but it had always been relatively small, begins to grow in the 20th century, and it explodes after the Second World War. And middle-class Americans became just tremendous consumers. Right? If the 1920s was the birth of the consumer age, the 1950s and 60s was probably one of its peaks. Americans were buying everything they can get their hands on. Cars, TVs, you name it. We liked to spend money. Now, part of this is understandable. Remember, the people who were adults in the 1950s had been kids during the Great Depression. Many of them had grown up with very little, and then they had to fight in World War II. And so now, finally, they have a chance to have it easier, and the good life, as they called it. And the good life usually included lots and lots of stuff, as you can see in the picture here. Right? So we were buying everything that producers were putting on the shelves, and then some. Cars, right? 1950s, really a great car decade. I mean, look how big the cars were too. The bigger the car, the more prosperity, more power it seemed to convey. So let's now look at what was causing this massive economic growth. Why was the economy booming, and why was it red hot? Well, there's a bunch of reasons, okay? Part of this is circumstance. Remember, World War II had been absolutely devastating to Europe and parts of Asia. And America was pretty much untouched by World War II, right? There were, no bombs fell on American cities other than, Hawaii, of course. And this was something that America had a great advantage with. And remember, we had been producing just obscene amounts of everything in World War II. Tanks, airplanes, boats, machine guns, helmets, you name it. And those factories are at peak perfection, and they're ready now to transition to, not producing B-17 bombers, but Cadillacs. We are ready to transition into peacetime, and we're ready to go. And we have no real competitors because all of our competitors are still digging out from the rubble. So let's get into some specifics. Number one on our list, huge military budgets. So because of the Cold War, America continued spending, and by America I mean the federal government began spending at levels it really had never done before, and a sustained heavy spending, which is going to help grow and mature industries, things like the aerospace industry, the electronics industries, these things that are going to then help boost the economy by coming up with new technologies and new developments. And again, we had to beat the Soviets, and one of the ways to beat the Soviets is with better technology, and that technology has more than just defense purposes, a lot of civilian uses for that same technology. Number two reason, cheap energy. So in the 1940s and 50s, the United States and Europeans controlled many of the big oil fields in the Middle East, and therefore we had cheap oil. And cheap oil means cheap plastics, means cheap diesel fuel, means cheap electricity. Speaking of electricity, we are producing more electricity than ever before. Our electric production increased something like 600% between 1945 and 1970. So we have the power to build, to thrive. Factor 3, increased productivity. So between 1950 and 1970, your average worker was putting out more production per hour at about 3% annual growth. Now 3% may not seem like a big deal, but if you're increasing production 3% every year for 20 years, that's a lot of increased production. And again, when I say increased productivity per worker, I'm not saying you're just adding more workers. What we're saying is that existing workers become more efficient, more productive, largely because of technology and automation. And this is going to help double the standard of living in America. Number 4, very productive agriculture. It has been quite a while since we've talked about farming, right? The last time we talked about farming in any serious amount was probably the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. And we haven't talked about them lately because America is becoming more and more industrialized and moving towards sector service jobs, not farming jobs. And one of the reasons we're able to do that is because our farmers are so incredibly productive. Healthy government subsidies, more equipment than ever, better fertilizers, better science behind the farming, consolidating smaller inefficient farms into larger productive farms. You name it, America is producing more food than ever before, more food than we could ever hope to consume. And also the number of people we need farming is decreasing rapidly to having single-digit percentage of Americans being farmers, as opposed to upwards of half or more just a couple generations ago. Number 5 reason for this economic growth, the electronics industry is born. In many ways, the electronics industry is a reaction to World War II. Remember, we have to come up with better technologies to beat the Nazis and the Japanese, and then during the Cold War, we're going to have to beat the Soviets, and so technology, including electronics, was seen as the key. And one of the keys was this new invention called the transistor. And the transistor is going to allow for smaller electronics and really, in many ways, the birth of computers. So with the transistor, this little thing right here, this little chip, comes modern technology, modern electronics. And so computers become more commonplace. Now, these are not home computers yet. These are computers used in big business or for the defense industry or scientists or something like that. And they basically what they did was what their name is. They computed. They were like big calculators, basically. But it leads the way to ever faster, ever more powerful, and ever smaller and cheaper computers over the next several decades. All right, 6th factor, the GI Bill of Rights. So as World War II was starting to wind down, our Congress was wondering, okay, what do we do with all of these returning veterans? And it was decided that we needed to kind of gradually phase them back into the economy. How do we do that? Well, let's set aside lots and lots of federal dollars to send our young veterans back to school, send them off to college and trade schools and so forth. And so as a young veteran, you could draw on your GI Bill of Rights and you would be able to go back to school and get yourself an education, more job skills. The GI Bill of Rights also set aside money for very, very generous loans to help veterans buy homes and open businesses. And collectively, the GI Bill of Rights basically is going to serve as a catalyst to help get the economy booming again in the 1950s. It is really one of the seeds that's going to grow into the economic prosperity of the 50s and 60s. All right, now with increased prosperity and World War II behind us, it's time to settle down and have families. And that brings us to the famous baby boom. So in the 15 years after World War II, some 50 million babies were added to the U.S. population. And if you do the math, that's about 1 every 10 seconds. So America is being flooded by little Americans. and Americans are having families and marrying in record numbers. Well, that dramatic increase in population, especially young populations, has all kinds of ripple effects. We need to build more homes. We need to build more schools. We need to find ways to employ these people when they become teenagers and young adults. We also have a whole new market, right? People can get rich selling products geared towards little kids, toys and food and clothes, you name it. And so businesses found the baby boom generation as a gold mine. And the baby boomers are still a major target for producers today, although products have changed, right? We're not selling them bikes anymore. We're selling them simple cell phones because they can't figure out apparently how to use a real cell phone, or so the commercials tell you. Some very creepy baby boomer consumers. I especially do not want to eat anything that this guy has. All right, now let's go to the suburbs. So with the vast increase in population comes a need for more homes. And it turns out Americans didn't want to live down in the center of the city as much anymore. They want to live somewhere else. They want to live in the suburbs. And the suburbs are able to be built largely because we're also building a very large highway system in this time period. The interstate highway system is another key factor in the increased productivity in the 1950s and 60s as we tie our cities together with high-speed highways and also allowing people to live out on the edge of the city and commute in via these highways. And for this growing middle class, for many of them, the suburbs really seemed like the fulfillment of the American dream. Having their, quarter-acre white picket fence, barbecue grill out back, neighbors. This was seen as really the good life. Now, I know some of us would probably scoff at that today, but this really was seen as the good life for tens of millions of Americans. A great example of these suburbs would be Leavitt Town, outside of New York City. So the Leavitt brothers had gotten a lot of construction experience during World War II. They had helped build airfields and other buildings and such for the military, and they learned how to do things quickly and efficiently. And they took those skills from World War II and applied them to the civilian side of things. And remember, we've got all these young veterans. They've got their FHA loan. They want to go buy a new house. Well, we got to produce homes like there's no tomorrow. And so what the Leavitt brothers did is they almost scientifically studied the process of building a home. And they broke it down into something like 27 individual steps. And each of these steps would be performed by a specialized crew who did just that one thing. And they did it very quickly and very efficiently. And the crews would go from house to house to house doing this process almost like an assembly line, and they were churning out homes faster than ever before. And because they're mass producing homes, they also turn out to be very affordable. And so Leavitt Town went from basically, go back to the picture here, Leavitt Town basically went from being a potato field out on Long Island to being a city into itself. This is amazing how quickly this went up. And again, the homes they're not big, they're not fancy, but for a lot of Americans who had never owned a home, this was luxury. This was utopia. Buying your little house out in the suburbs that's yours and you can afford and you can raise a family in. Leavitt Town, by the way, is still there, right? You can go to Leavitt Town, New York today and see these homes, many of which are original. And there were also Leavitt Town communities that sprout up elsewhere, and then, of course, copies of Leavitt Town all across America. And the modern subdivision really is the legacy of the Leavitt brothers. Now, not all of this suburban growth is happy. Some of it has a dark side. We call this white flight. So a lot of these would-be suburban American families, white families, are moving from the city center out to the suburbs. And these neighborhoods are emptying out of whites and being filled in by blacks from the south. So remember the Great Migration we've talked so much about? it's continuing. So you have what had been overwhelmingly white neighborhoods being very quickly transitioned to overwhelmingly black neighborhoods in cities all across the north. You have, and out in the west as well. So you have whole neighborhoods in Chicago or Detroit or Toledo or Pittsburgh or Philadelphia that are overwhelmingly black that had been overwhelmingly white because the whites are going out to the suburbs or fleeing to the suburbs. All right, so you might be thinking to yourself, well, why is that really a big deal? Well, the reason is these white families tended to be wealthier, middle class, maybe even upper middle class, working class, whatever. And as they go out to the suburbs, they take with them businesses. So businesses that had catered to the population in the inner city are now also moving out to the suburbs. And also, the wealthier people moving out the suburbs means you have poorer people left behind, which means the tax base of the inner city goes down. So in other words, the city has less money to maintain schools and roads than they did when it was a white population. And you see this sort of urban decay continuing really for the rest of the 20th century. Detroit is famous for this. You can see a couple of images here from Google Streets where you can see just the same street kind of over just a couple of years. This is, I believe, 2009, 2011, 2013, how basically it's just disappearing, how it transitions away until now there's just a couch left where there had been a house. So what makes this so negative is that black Americans, I'm sure, would have wanted to go out to the suburbs as well, but they were prevented from doing so in large numbers, and that's because the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, would often refuse mortgages to non-whites. And thus, they couldn't get their hands on the money to buy a house, so they were left in these inner cities, living in apartment buildings, and in some cases, if they really couldn't afford anything else better, into public housing projects. And these public housing complexes sprout up in the 1940s and 50s and 60s in a lot of major cities across America. And they become zones of poverty and hopelessness for many of the residents. All right, now let's talk a little bit about migration, the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt. Let's compare and contrast these two zones in America. So the Sun Belt refers to basically the South and Southwest. So think of kind of like from basically the Carolinas, maybe Virginia as well. Basically from Virginia all the way down to California and Nevada, kind of like right through here. This is the so-called Sun Belt, and we're going to see in those post-war decades tremendous population growth. Okay, you can see from 1940 to 1950, for example, California's population goes up 53%. Okay, Texas's goes up 20%. Arizona, 50%. Other states in the north growing much more slowly, only 6% in Pennsylvania, 9.5% in Wisconsin, 5.25% in Vermont. So slower growth, rapid growth. And here, if we were actually to drag the timeline even further out, this is from 1950 until 2002. In those 50 years, California's population is going to more than double. Alaska's quadruple. Texas's almost doubles. Okay, Colorado more than doubles. Nevada's population goes up over 10 times. This is incredible growth, and you just don't see it in a lot of the other states in the north. Yes, their population might be growing, with the exception of places like West Virginia, but it's not growing very quickly. So what brings people to the Sun Belt? Better job opportunities, and things like the aerospace industries, better climate. I mean, let's be honest. Personally, I like cold weather, so it doesn't bother me at all. But I know for a lot of people, the idea of living in somewhere cold, where it's kind of gray and drizzly in the wintertime, and you get a lot of snow, and they'd rather you living on a beach in Florida somewhere, right? I personally wouldn't, but hey, that's just me. Most people like warmer climate, and you're going to see it in the South. Also, lower taxes, so it's more attractive to move there. In other words, cost of living is less. And you have these industries we were talking about earlier starting to really form in places like California, Florida, and Texas. These upcoming booming industries where it's clear this is the future. Again, climate differences. Which one would you rather live in? So what about the left behind areas? Well, this is known as the Rust Belt. So the Rust Belt was the area that during the Gilded Age had rapidly industrialized. The cities had swelled with industrial workers and immigrants, and it had dominated American industry, economy, and politics for several generations. And then all of a sudden, with industries leaving and going to the south and also going overseas, this area left behind just started to hurt. And we call it the Rust Belt because it's this sort of mental image of what had been at one time a booming factory that is now abandoned and rusting and collapsing. You know, that's kind of the image you saw with the Rust Belt. Now, there's still some of that in this area today, where economically they're still hurting, even after, you know, years of having to adjust to this. It's not maybe as bad as it has been, but it's certainly the late 20th century and the early 21st century has not been kind to this area right through here. And in fact, if you look out of the nation's 100 largest cities in the 1960s, the ones with the greatest drops in population were almost all in the Rust Belt. Okay, places like Youngstown, Ohio, St. Louis, Missouri, Cleveland, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This is indication of big industry moving out, either going to the south or going overseas where it's cheaper labor. And those companies will then boom there, but the workers are left behind without a job. And again, when I think of Rust Belt, this is what I think of. And it's really sad to think of these areas at one time had supported millions of working class families, and now it's just a heap of rubble and twisted metal. This had been a school in Detroit, and now, as you can see, abandoned. Alright guys, that is it for our causes and effects of migrations and also economic development. Look back over why the economy was booming after World War II, and then definitely look back to migration patterns, whether it's white flight, whether that's the Rust Belt, the Sun Belt. Just know where people are moving and why they're moving there.